I stood at the front of the room, my father's casket mere feet away, surrounded by people who had come to pay their respects. His friends from the war, his neighbors, even old colleagues from the factory. All of them sat quietly, waiting for the ceremony to begin. I should have been focused on delivering the eulogy, honoring the man who taught me everything about strength, loyalty, and love. Instead, I felt my pulse quicken, my temples throbbing as I watched Grace and Dylan stroll into the room. They were late, not just a little late, late enough that the minister had already given the opening prayer and the first hymn was halfway sung. Heads turned as they shuffled down the aisle. Grace, dressed in a tight black dress and heels that clicked loudly on the wooden floor, waved apologetically as though she'd interrupted a casual meeting. Dylan, my 17-year-old stepson, trailed behind her, his earbuds still dangling around his neck and his hands jammed into the pockets of his baggy jeans. The irritation in the room was palpable. A few of my father's old war buddies exchanged glances, their lined faces showing their disapproval. My Aunt Ruth, seated in the front row, pursed her lips so tightly they practically disappeared. I swallowed my anger and gestured subtly to an empty row near the back, hoping they'd quietly take their seats. Instead, Grace made a show of scanning the room. She leaned over to me and whispered, loud enough for several people to hear, "Why didn't you save us better seats?" I clenched my jaw, my fingers gripping the sides of the podium. "Just sit down, Grace," I murmured, trying to keep my voice calm. She rolled her eyes but finally settled into the pew. Dylan plopped down beside her, slouching immediately and pulling out his phone. The glow of the screen lit up his face as he started scrolling. I forced myself to take a deep breath, gripping my note cards for the eulogy. This day wasn't about them. I began speaking, my voice shaky but studying with each word as I talked about my father's life. His courage during the war, his tireless work at the factory, the sacrifices he made to raise me after my mother passed. I could feel the room listening, leaning into the memories I shared. But then, just as I was recounting a story about my father mentoring a young coworker, a muffled laugh cut through the air. I glanced over to see Dylan holding up his phone, showing Grace a meme. She covered her mouth to stifle a giggle, but it was too late. The sound had already broken the solemnity of the room. My stomach twisted as I caught the disapproving stares from my father's friends, the quiet murmurs spreading among the crowd. I powered through the rest of the eulogy, refusing to let their disrespect derail me completely. But the damage was done. By the time I finished, I could barely look at the people in the room. I sat down, hands shaking, while the minister took over to lead a prayer. As the service ended and people began to file out, offering their condolences, I overheard snippets of conversation. "The boy needs to learn some manners," one of the veterans muttered. "Can you believe that woman?" Another whispered. My Aunt Ruth approached me, her expression softening when she saw the pain on my face. "Ethan," she said gently, resting a hand on my shoulder, "your father deserved better than that. I'm sorry." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Grace and Dylan, oblivious to the tension they'd caused, mingled near the coffee table in the back. Grace was talking animatedly to someone about the struggles of managing her online boutique, as if she were at a networking event. Dylan had taken a seat and was loudly playing a video game on his phone, the sound effects cutting through the quiet conversations around him. When we got into the car later, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "What the hell was that?" I snapped, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "What was what?" Grace asked, her tone defensive. "Your behavior at the funeral," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "Do you have any idea how disrespectful you were? Laughing during the eulogy, talking over people." "Oh, come on, Ethan," she said, rolling her eyes. "It's not like anyone noticed." I let out a bitter laugh. "Everyone noticed, Grace. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed yourselves." Dylan groaned from the back seat. "Are we seriously doing this right now? It's not a big deal. It was just some old dude's funeral." My hands tightened on the wheel, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. "That old dude was my father," I said quietly. Whatever, Dylan muttered, pulling his earbuds over his ears. I glanced at Grace, hoping for some acknowledgement, some apology, but she just stared out the window, her expression unreadable. The rest of the drive was silent, but my mind was racing. I thought about my father's advice, his belief that respect wasn't just given, it was earned, but sometimes it had to be taught. I clenched my jaw, a plan already beginning to form in the back of my mind. When we got home, I went to my study and closed the door. Sitting at my desk, I pulled out one of my father's old journals and flipped through the pages, looking for inspiration. I came across a line he had written years ago. Actions speak louder than words. Teach them through example, and let the lesson hit where it hurts. I sat back in my chair, staring at the journal. Grace and Dylan needed to understand what they had done. Not just to me, but to the memory of a man who deserved far more respect than they had shown. By the time I closed the journal, the plan was clear in my mind. The memorial weekend at the cabin would be more than just a tribute to my father. It would be an opportunity to teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. And I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not this time. The house was quiet when I woke up the next morning. The kind of quiet that felt heavy. Grace was still asleep, and Dylan was likely in his room with his headphones on, doing whatever it was he spent hours doing on his phone. The weight of yesterday's events sat on my chest like a stone. My father's funeral was supposed to be a day of honor, a reflection of the life he had lived. Instead, it had turned into a spectacle of their selfishness, and I couldn't let it go. I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window as the coffee brewed. The backyard, overgrown with weeds I kept meaning to pull, reminded me of the cabin. My father had always called it his sanctuary, the one place where he could clear his head and connect with the things that mattered. I used to spend summers there with him, fishing in the lake, chopping wood for the fireplace, and listening to stories about his time in the war. The memories were sharp, almost tangible, and they brought a clarity I hadn't felt in months. By the time Grace came downstairs, the plan had started to take shape in my mind. She walked into the kitchen in her silk robe, her hair tied back, and poured herself a cup of coffee without so much as a glance in my direction. I waited until she took her first sip before speaking. I want us to go to the cabin this weekend, I said. She raised an eyebrow, still not looking at me. The cabin? Why? Because we need it, I said simply. It's been a rough week, and I think some time away from the city will do us good. Dylan can come too. At the mention of Dylan, she finally looked at me, skepticism written all over her face. Dylan hates the outdoors, Ethan. He's not going to sit around in a dusty old cabin for the weekend. He doesn't have a choice, I said, my tone firm. Neither do you. Grace's eyes narrowed. What's this really about? It's about honoring my father, I said, holding her gaze. And about us spending some time together as a family. She huffed but didn't argue further. She knew better than to push me when I spoke with that kind of finality. Dylan put up more resistance when I told him after breakfast, grumbling that he had plans with his friends. But I didn't budge. By the end of the conversation, he threw his hands up and stalked off to his room, muttering something under his breath about how unfair I was. The drive to the cabin was tense, as I expected it to be. Grace spent most of it on her phone, scrolling through social media and occasionally sighing as if to remind me how bored she was. Dylan had his earbuds in and stared out the window, ignoring the world around him. I focused on the road, my hands steady on the wheel as the miles passed. The farther we got from the city, the more I could feel the weight in my chest begin to lift. This was the right decision. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it. Sturdy and unassuming, tucked away in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. The lake shimmered in the distance, its surface rippling in the afternoon breeze. I parked the car and got out, inhaling deeply. The air here always smelled different, fresher somehow, like it carried the essence of the forest itself. Grace stepped out of the car and wrinkled her nose. It's smaller than I remembered. Dylan groaned as he dragged his duffel bag from the trunk. There's no Wi-Fi, is there? No, I said, not bothering to hide my satisfaction. There isn't. We unloaded the car in silence and carried everything inside. The cabin had been well maintained, thanks to a caretaker my father had hired before he passed. The living room was just as it had always been, with its worn leather armchairs, stone fireplace, and shelves lined with old books and knickknacks. The kitchen was modest but functional, the dining table covered in a checkered tablecloth that had been there for as long as I could remember. Grace walked around, inspecting everything with a critical eye. This place could use some serious updating. It's fine the way it is, I said, setting my bag down. Let's just unpack and settle in. The afternoon was uneventful, but the tension lingered. Grace spent most of her time sitting on the porch with a magazine she'd brought, while Dylan wandered aimlessly, complaining about the lack of cell service. I let them be, knowing the real work would start the next day. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table eating the spaghetti I'd cooked, I decided to ease into the conversation. You know, I said, setting down my fork, this cabin meant a lot to my father. He used to say it was where he felt closest to himself. Dylan rolled his eyes. Cool story, Dad. Grace shot him a look but didn't say anything. I ignored him and continued. He used to tell me that this place reminded him of what mattered most. Family, respect, gratitude. There was a beat of silence before Grace finally spoke. That's nice, Ethan. But not everyone connects to places the same way you do. Maybe not, I said, keeping my tone even. But I think it's important to try. Dylan pushed his chair back and stood up. I'm going to bed. It's only 7, I said. Yeah, well, there's nothing else to do, he muttered as he walked off. Grace sighed and stood as well, picking up her plate. Don't push him too hard, Ethan. He's a teenager. He'll grow out of it. I didn't respond. Instead, I cleaned up the dishes and stepped outside onto the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. This was just the beginning. They didn't understand yet, but they would. Inside the cabin, I could hear Grace moving around, her footsteps light against the wooden floor. Dylan's muffled music leaked from behind his closed door. I leaned against the porch railing and stared out at the trees, the weight of the plan I'd set in motion settling on my shoulders. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. Tomorrow we'd start with the first lesson. The next morning I woke up early. The cabin was still and quiet, save for the faint rustle of the trees outside and the occasional chirp of a bird. I stepped into the kitchen and started making coffee, the earthy aroma filling the space as I planned out the day. Today wasn't just about spending time together. It was about opening their eyes to the legacy my father left behind and, more importantly, what they had so casually disrespected. By the time I finished my first cup, I heard movement upstairs. Grace came down first, looking groggy but polished, her robe cinched tightly around her waist. She glanced at me and then at the clock on the wall. You're up early, she said, pouring herself some coffee. I wanted to get started on the day, I replied. We've got a lot to do. Her brows furrowed. What do you mean? Cabin. What's there to do? You'll see, I said simply, taking another sip. Dylan appeared a few minutes later, wearing the same hoodie and sweatpants he'd worn yesterday. His hair was a mess, and his expression said he wanted nothing to do with the world. He poured himself a bowl of cereal and slumped into a chair, scrolling through his phone even though I knew there was no service. Finish up, I said, setting my cup down. We're heading out in half an hour. Heading out where? Dylan grumbled, not bothering to look up. I'll explain when we're ready to go, I said. Just eat. True to form, Grace protested as soon as I handed her a backpack. What exactly are we doing that requires hiking gear? She asked, glancing warily at the boots I'd set out for her. We're taking a walk through the woods, I said. There's something I want to show you. You mean a hike? She corrected, her tone dripping with irritation. Call it what you want, I said. It's happening. Dylan groaned audibly. This is so lame. Ignoring them both, I led the way out the door. The trail leading from the cabin was one I knew well, winding through the forest and gradually climbing toward a ridge that overlooked the lake. My father and I had walked it dozens of times, and I could almost hear his voice in my ear as I stepped over roots and ducked under low-hanging branches. The first mile was quiet except for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional sigh or muttered complaint from Dylan. Grace tried to distract herself by pointing out things on the trail, wildflowers, bird calls, but her disinterest was clear. I let the silence hang, knowing the view at the top would do the talking for me. When we reached the ridge, I stopped and gestured toward the clearing ahead. "Take a look." Grace walked forward reluctantly, her steps slowing as she reached the edge. Dylan followed, dragging his feet, but even he froze when he saw it. The lake stretched out below us, its surface shimmering in the sunlight, surrounded by dense green forest. In the distance, the peaks of the mountains rose like sentinels, their tops dusted with the last remnants of snow. "Wow," Grace said softly, almost despite herself. "It's beautiful," I said. "My father used to bring me here whenever life felt too heavy." He said it reminded him of everything he fought for. Dylan shifted uncomfortably. "Okay, cool. Can we go now?" I ignored him. Instead, I reached into my backpack and pulled out a small wooden box. "Before we head back, there's something I want to do." Grace turned, her eyes narrowing. "What's that?" I opened the box, revealing a folded American flag and a few medals. My father's Purple Heart, his Bronze Star. Dylan's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise with indifference. "These belong to my dad," I said, my voice steady. "He earned them for the sacrifices he made. Sacrifices that let us stand here today and take all of this for granted." Grace glanced at Dylan, her expression unreadable. Dylan just crossed his arms, looking away. I set the box down on a flat rock and took a deep breath. "We're going to take a moment to honor him. Not for me, not because I'm asking you to, but because it's the least we can do for a man who gave everything for the people he loved." Dylan sighed loudly. "This is so pointless." My temper flared, but I kept my voice calm. "You think it's pointless because you don't understand, but that's going to change." He rolled his eyes but stayed where he was, his arms still crossed. Grace sat down on a nearby log, her silence speaking volumes. I unfolded the flag and laid it out carefully, placing the medals on top. Then I stood back, letting the moment stretch out. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual rustling and chirping replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. Grace shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't speak. Dylan stared at the ground, his foot tapping against the dirt. After a while, I spoke again. "This isn't about guilt," I said. "It's about respect. My dad would have been the first to tell you that respect isn't automatic. It's something you show through your actions, not just your words." Grace finally looked up, her expression softening. "Ethan, we didn't mean to." "It's not about what you meant," I interrupted. "It's about what you did, and what you didn't do." Dylan's tapping stopped, the flag and medals away carefully, feeling the weight of the silence around me. The lesson wasn't complete yet, but I could tell the cracks were starting to form. Grace and Dylan didn't fully understand. Not yet, but the seeds had been planted. "Let's head back," I said, slinging the backpack over my shoulder. "We've got more to do tomorrow." They followed me down the trail, quieter than they'd been on the way up. I didn't press them for conversation, didn't try to explain further. I knew that sometimes the best lessons came in the moments of reflection afterward, when the words had a chance to sink in. When we reached the cabin, Grace retreated to the porch with a book, and Dylan disappeared into his room without a word. I sat in the living room, staring at the box of my father's belongings. The weight of the day's events settled over me, but I didn't feel defeated. Tomorrow would bring the next step. The next day began with a sharp chill in the air, the kind that made you draw your jacket tighter and breathe a little deeper. I stood on the porch, sipping my coffee as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. Today was the day we'd dig deeper, past the thin veneer of civility Grace and Dylan had been clinging to, and into something real. If yesterday had planted seeds, today would water them, whether they liked it or not. Grace was the first to come downstairs, dressed in her usual blend of stylish but impractical clothing. She arched an eyebrow at me as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Another hike? She asked, her voice laced with thinly veiled annoyance. No, I said, setting my mug down. Today we're staying close to the cabin. I've got something else in mind. Dylan shuffled into the kitchen not long after, his hoodie pulled up over his messy hair. He grabbed a banana from the counter and looked at me suspiciously. What now? More nature lectures. I ignored the jab. I need you both outside in 10 minutes. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty. Grace frowned. Ethan, what are you planning? You'll see, I said, offering no further explanation. I left them to their grumbling and went outside to prepare. Behind the cabin, the old toolshed stood exactly as I remembered it, weathered but sturdy. I unlocked the door and pulled out what I needed. A rusted shovel, a pair of work gloves, and a bucket. My father had kept this shed meticulously organized, each tool hanging in its designated spot, and it struck me how even this mundane act spoke to the kind of man he was. Orderly, reliable, respectful. When Grace and Dylan finally joined me, their faces were a mix of curiosity and annoyance. Grace had traded her usual chic attire for a pair of leggings and an oversized sweatshirt, while Dylan looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. What are we doing? Grace asked, crossing her arms. Digging? I said simply, handing her a pair of gloves. There's an old garden plot back here my dad used to tend. We're gonna clear it out. Dylan let out a loud groan. You're kidding, right? No, I said firmly. He planted this garden every spring, even in years when he barely had time to breathe. It was his way of giving back to the land, and it's our way of showing some respect for his memory. Grace hesitated, glancing at the shovel in my hand. Ethan, I don't know the first thing about gardening. You don't need to, I said. You just need to be willing to put in the work. I handed Dylan the shovel and directed him toward the overgrown patch of weeds and tangled vines that had once been a neat rectangle of soil. He sighed dramatically but started digging, albeit with the enthusiasm of someone being forced to clean their room. Grace knelt beside the plot, pulling weeds with a delicate grip that suggested she was afraid of breaking a nail. The first hour was a struggle. Dylan complained incessantly, alternating between grumbling about the unfairness of manual labor and making sarcastic comments about how great this bonding experience was. Grace's frustration simmered just beneath the surface, her movements growing sharper as the sun climbed higher. But slowly, something began to shift. As the plot started to take shape, as the weeds were cleared and the rich, dark soil was exposed, a different kind of energy emerged. Grace stopped fussing over her gloves and started working with more focus, her hands moving steadily as she unearthed stubborn roots. Dylan's complaints grew less frequent, replaced by determined silence as he hacked away at a particularly tough patch of earth. By mid-afternoon, the garden plot was clear. We stood back, sweaty and dirty, surveying our work. The rectangle of bare soil looked almost ceremonial, a blank canvas waiting to be brought back to life. Not bad, I said, brushing the dirt off my hands. But we're not done yet. Dylan groaned. Seriously? What now? I walked to the edge of the plot and opened the bucket I'd brought from the shed. Inside were several small pouches of seeds, tomatoes, carrots, beans, and marigolds. My father had always said marigolds were his favorite because they kept the pests away. We're going to plant, I said, handing the pouches to Grace. This is the easy part. Grace looked at the seeds, her expression softening. He used to grow all of this? Every year, I said. And he made sure there was always enough to share with the neighbors. Dylan took a pouch reluctantly, glancing at the label. What's the point? We're not going to be here long enough to see anything grow. Maybe not, I said. But that's not the point. The point is to start something, to put effort into something that isn't about instant gratification. He didn't respond, but he knelt down and started planting the seeds, following my instructions without argument. Grace joined in, her movements more deliberate now, as if she was beginning to understand the significance of what we were doing. By the time we finished, the sun was starting to set, casting a warm golden light over the freshly planted garden. I stood back, feeling a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in a long time. This was what my father had wanted. A legacy that wasn't about wealth or success but about connection and care. Dylan straightened up, brushing the dirt off his hands. It actually looks kind of cool. Grace smiled faintly, her gaze lingering on the garden. Your dad must have been proud of this. He was, I said. And he would have been proud of you too, for doing this today. Dylan looked away, his face unreadable, but I caught the slightest flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe understanding. It was too early to tell. We cleaned up and headed inside, the tension that had been hanging over us since the funeral starting to lift, if only slightly. Grace cooked dinner for the first time in weeks. A simple pasta dish that tasted better than anything we'd had in a while. Dylan even helped set the table without being asked. As we sat together, eating in a comfortable silence, I realized this was the first real moment of connection we'd had in months. It wasn't perfect and there was still a long way to go, but it was a start. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the porch, the cool night air a welcome relief. The stars were brighter here, their light unpolluted by the city, and I found myself thinking of my father again. He would have loved today, loved seeing his family come together, even if it was begrudgingly. Grace joined me a few minutes later, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't say anything, just stood beside me, her gaze fixed on the garden plot. You're trying, Ethan, she said softly. I see that. So are you, I said. And that's all I ask. She smiled faintly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about honoring my father anymore. It was about rebuilding what we'd lost and maybe, just maybe, finding something even stronger in the process. The next morning brought a sense of calm to the cabin. The sun filtered through the trees in golden beams, and the birds chirped with an almost overzealous cheerfulness. For the first time since we'd arrived, I felt like the heaviness in the air had lessened, even if just slightly. Grace and Dylan weren't up yet, so I took the opportunity to sit on the porch with my coffee, enjoying the stillness. My father had always talked about the mornings here, how they felt like a fresh start no matter what the day before had brought. As I stared out at the trees, I found myself wondering what he'd think of how things were unfolding. He wasn't the type to sugarcoat. He'd tell me if I was being too hard on them, but he'd also remind me that respect wasn't something you could compromise on. The creak of the cabin door behind me broke my thoughts. Dylan stepped out, his hair sticking up in every direction. He looked surprised to see nodding toward the empty chair next to me. Morning, he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. He hesitated before sitting down, glancing out at the woods like he wasn't sure what to make of them. You're up early, I said. Couldn't sleep, he replied, his voice low. After a pause, he added, It's too quiet here. I smiled faintly. It takes some getting used to. You'll miss it once we're back in the city. Dylan didn't respond, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. I let the silence stretch, figuring it was better not to push. After a few minutes, Grace joined us, her steps slower than usual. She was wrapped in a cardigan, her face soft with the kind of weariness that comes from deep thinking. Coffee? I asked, gesturing toward the pot. Please, she said, sinking into the chair on my other side. She looked out at the same view Dylan had been staring at moments earlier, her expression contemplative. I decided to break the quiet. We're heading into town today. Grace turned to me, surprised. Town? Why? There's someone I want you both to meet, I said. One of my dad's old friends. He was part of Dad's unit in the army. I think it'll give you some perspective. Dylan groaned softly, but Grace nodded, her curiosity piqued. All right, she said. What's his name? Frank, I said. He lives just outside of the main square. He and my dad stayed close after the war. Frank helped him with the cabin more times than I can count. The drive into town was quiet but not uncomfortable. Grace seemed lost in thought, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. Dylan had his earbuds in, though I doubted he had much to listen to without a signal. As we pulled into the small downtown area, I felt a wave of nostalgia. The old brick buildings and mom-and-pop stores hadn't changed much since I was a kid. Frank's house was modest but well-kept. A single-story structure with a small garden out front. He was waiting for us on the porch, a wiry man with a weathered face and kind eyes. As we stepped out of the car, he smiled and came forward to greet us. "Ethan," he said, pulling me into a firm hug. "It's been too long, son." "Good to see you, Frank," I said, stepping back. "This is my wife, Grace, and my stepson, Dylan." Frank nodded to them, his eyes sharp but warm. "Pleasure to meet you both. Your dad spoke about you a lot, Ethan. Always proud of you." "Thanks," I said, my chest tightening at the mention of my father. Frank invited us inside, where the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. His living room was cozy and filled with photographs, some of family, others of his time in the army. One wall was dominated by a framed picture of his unit, my father front and center, smiling in his uniform. "That's him," I said, gesturing to the photo as Dylan and Grace looked around. "Third from the left." "He was a hell of a man," Frank said, his voice tinged with emotion. "Smart, brave, and loyal to the core. He'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it." Grace lingered near the photo, her brow furrowed. "Ethan's told us some stories, but I guess it's hard to really understand what he went through." Frank nodded, motioning for us to sit. "It's not easy to explain, but I'll do my best. Your father, well, he wasn't just a soldier. He was a leader, the kind of guy who kept morale up even when things looked bleak." For the next hour, Frank told stories about my father. Stories I'd heard bits and pieces of over the years, but never in such vivid detail. He talked about the missions they'd been on, the sacrifices they'd made, and the bond they'd shared. Grace listened intently, her expression softening with each word. Even Dylan seemed engaged, leaning forward slightly as Frank spoke. At one point, Frank turned to Dylan. "You remind me of him, you know. Not in looks, but in the way you carry yourself. Your dad, he had a stubborn streak too. But once he found his purpose, there was no stopping him." Dylan blinked, caught off guard. "I'm nothing like him," Frank chuckled. "You might be surprised, kid. It's in there. You just haven't found the right spark yet." After we said our goodbyes and headed back to the car, the drive home was noticeably different. Grace was quiet, but not in the same distant way she'd been before. She seemed thoughtful, her eyes flicking to me every so often as if she was seeing me in a new light. Dylan sat in the back, staring out the window with an expression I couldn't quite read. When we got back to the cabin, Grace pulled me aside while Dylan went to his room. "Thank you," she said softly, "for taking us to see Frank. I didn't realize how much he gave." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I needed you to understand. It's not just about him, it's about what he stood for, and what we should stand for." She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I get it now. I really do." It was a small moment, but it felt like a breakthrough. As we stood there, the weight of the past few days seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. Tomorrow, I thought, would be another step forward. The next morning, the air was crisp and the sky clear, a perfect reflection of the subtle shift in our dynamic. Grace and Dylan seemed more at ease, though there was still an undercurrent of tension, the kind that wouldn't dissipate with a single conversation or shared experience. Healing takes time, and I knew better than to expect too much too soon. I decided it was time to shift gears, to take the lessons of the past few days and apply them to something more tangible. Over breakfast, I laid out the plan. "I want to take you both somewhere today," I said, slicing into a piece of toast. "There's a spot about an hour from here, one of my dad's favorite places. It's important." Grace set down her coffee, her brow furrowing. "Important how?" "You'll see," I said. "It's a surprise." Dylan groaned, leaning back in his chair. "Another one of your important lessons? Can't we just have one normal day?" "You've had plenty of normal days," I replied evenly. "This is about understanding something bigger than yourself. Trust me." He didn't argue further, though the eye roll he gave me spoke volumes. Grace, to her credit, seemed more curious than annoyed. We packed a light lunch and set out, the road winding through dense forests and occasional clearings that offered glimpses of distant hills. Grace spent most of the drive looking out the window, her expression unreadable, while Dylan slouched in the back seat with his headphones on. I let the quiet settle, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. When we arrived, the first thing that hit me was the smell of pine and earth, fresh and invigorating. The spot wasn't much to look at initially, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, but it held a deep significance. In the center of the clearing was a wooden bench my father and I had built years ago, weathered but still sturdy. "This is it?" Dylan asked, his tone skeptical. "It's just trees." "It's more than that," I said, stepping out of the car. "Come on." They followed me reluctantly as I led them to the bench. I gestured for them to sit while I stood in front of them, hands in my pockets. For a moment, I didn't speak, letting the weight of the place settle over us. "This spot," I began, "is where my dad came when he needed clarity. When life got too noisy, too complicated, he'd come here to think. He called it his quiet sanctuary." Grace looked around, her gaze softening. "It's peaceful." "It is," I said, "but it's also a place of reflection, of honesty. My dad used to say this was where you couldn't hide from yourself. Out here, there's nothing but you and your thoughts, and maybe that's exactly what we need right now." Dylan crossed his arms, clearly unimpressed. "So what? We're supposed to sit here and think?" "Not just think," I said, my voice firm. "Talk, listen, be real with each other." Grace sighed, rubbing her temples. "Ethan, I appreciate what you're trying to do. But what?" I cut in. "We've been skirting around the real issues for weeks, months even. You both disrespected my father's memory at the funeral. Do you have any idea how much that hurt? How much it still hurts?" My voice cracked slightly, and I took a deep breath to steady myself. Grace looked down, guilt flickering across her face. Dylan shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. I continued. "I've tried to be patient, to give you both space to adjust. But this crossed a line. And it's not just about the funeral, it's about everything that led up to it. The lack of respect, the selfishness. It has to stop." Grace finally looked up, her eyes glistening. "You're right," she said quietly. "I was selfish. I didn't think about what you needed, only what I wanted to avoid. I let my discomfort take over, and that's not fair to you. Or your father." I nodded, appreciating her honesty. "Thank you for saying that." She reached for my hand, her grip firm. "I mean it, Ethan. I'll do better." I turned to Dylan, who was staring at the ground. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you have anything to say?" For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he muttered. "I guess I was just angry at everything. At you, at Mom, at having to be here. I didn't think about how it made you feel. And now," oppressed, he shrugged but finally met my gaze. "Now I feel like maybe I was wrong. About some of it, at least. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a start. I decided to let it sit, to give him the space to process. Sometimes progress came in small steps, and this was better than nothing." We spent the rest of the afternoon there, sitting in companionable silence as the sun moved across the sky. Grace and I shared stories about my dad, painting a picture of the man he was and the values he held. Dylan listened quietly, his expression softening as the hours passed. When it was time to leave, I felt lighter, like a weight I'd been carrying for weeks had finally lifted. Grace seemed more at peace, her shoulders less tense, and even Dylan walked with a bit more purpose. As we drove back to the cabin, the sunset casting everything in a warm golden glow, I realized this was the first time in a long while that I felt hopeful. Hopeful that we could heal, that we could rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but we were finally moving in the right direction. And that was enough for now. The morning after our visit to my father's quiet sanctuary, I felt a subtle shift in the air around the cabin. It wasn't drastic. There was no sudden warmth or cheerfulness from Grace or Dylan, but there was a quietness, a sense of something settling. I could see it in the way Grace lingered longer over her coffee, staring out the window as though she were seeing the forest for the first time. I saw it in Dylan, who, for once, wasn't glued to his phone but was instead flipping through an old paperback he'd found on the shelf. I knew we were nearing something important, a moment where everything could either solidify or fall apart. And I knew it was time for the next step. "Today's going to be different," I said over breakfast, breaking the silence. Grace looked up from her mug, her eyes curious but cautious. Dylan raised an eyebrow, chewing on a piece of toast. "What now?" Dylan asked, his tone less combative than usual. "We're going to honor my father properly," I said. "Tonight we'll have a memorial ceremony, just us. But first we need to prepare." "Prepare how?" Grace asked. "By understanding what honoring someone really means," I said. "It's not just about saying the right words. It's about understanding the person, their values, their sacrifices, and showing that you care enough to carry their legacy forward." Grace nodded slowly, her face thoughtful. Dylan sighed but didn't argue. The first part of the day was spent sifting through my father's belongings. I led them to the attic, a space my dad had always referred to as his treasury, though it was more a jumble of boxes, old furniture, and keepsakes than anything else. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the small window as we started opening boxes. Grace picked up an old photograph of my father and his unit, the same one we'd seen at Frank's house but smaller and more weathered. She studied it for a long time, running her fingers over the edges. "He looks so young," she said softly. "He was," I said, "barely out of high school when he enlisted." "Most of them were." Dylan opened a box marked fishing gear and pulled out an old tackle box and a well-worn fishing rod. "Did he really use this stuff?" he asked, holding the rod up like it was an artifact from another era. "All the time," I said, smiling faintly. "He taught me how to fish with that rod. He always said it wasn't about catching anything. It was about the patience it taught you." Dylan frowned, as though trying to process the idea of fishing for patience rather than results. He set the rod down carefully, almost reverently, and moved on to the next box. As the hours passed, we pieced together fragments of my father's life. Medals, journals, letters he'd written to my mother, and tools he'd repaired countless times. Each item told a story, painting a picture of a man who was thoughtful, resourceful, and deeply committed to his family and community. When we finally emerged from the attic, the air between us felt different. Grace and Dylan were quieter, but not in the awkward or dismissive way they'd been earlier in the trip. It was the kind of quiet that comes from reflection, from realizing the weight of something you hadn't fully understood before. That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, I set up a small ceremony outside by the garden we'd cleared. I placed my father's flag and medals on the table, along with the photograph Grace had found and a few of the items we'd brought down from the attic. The garden itself stood as a symbol of our effort, a patch of earth where we'd worked together, however reluctantly, to create something meaningful. Grace lit a few candles, their soft glow flickering in the evening breeze. Dylan stood nearby, shifting on his feet but staying close, his eyes fixed on the table. I stepped forward, holding a piece of paper in my hand. "This is a letter my dad wrote to me years ago," I said. "I found it when I was packing up his things after he passed. I'd like to read it to you." Grace nodded, her eyes glistening. Dylan stayed silent but attentive. I unfolded the paper, my hands steady despite the emotion welling up inside me. "Ethan," I began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you these things myself. But I hope you'll carry these words with you. Life is about respect, not just for others but for yourself. It's about finding the things that matter and holding on to them, even when the world tries to pull you in 100 different directions. You'll face challenges, moments when you'll want to give up or give in. But don't. Stand firm in what you believe is right. And above all, remember that the measure of a person isn't what they take from the world, but what they give back to it. I love you, son. Always." My voice wavered on the last sentence, and I had to take a moment to collect myself. Grace reached out and placed a hand on my arm, her grip warm and steady. Dylan looked down, his jaw tightening as though he were fighting something back. I wanted you to hear this, I said, my voice softer now, because I think it's a lesson we all need to remember. Respect, patience, understanding, they're not just words. They're actions, choices, and they're not always easy, but they're always worth it. Grace nodded, her eyes shining. He was a remarkable man, Ethan. Thank you for sharing that with us. Dylan shifted again, his hands stuffed into his pockets. I didn't know, he said quietly, about any of this, about him. You do now, I said, and it's never too late to honor someone, to show them the respect they deserve. He nodded, his eyes still on the table. For the first time, I saw something crack in his facade, something raw and genuine. We stood there for a while longer, the three of us, surrounded by the soft glow of the candles and the quiet hum of the forest. It wasn't a grand ceremony or a dramatic turning point, but it was real. It was honest. And for the first time, I felt like we were truly beginning to understand each other. The next day, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The weight of what we had just shared hung in the air like a fragile promise, one that could shatter with a wrong word or a sudden misstep. But there was something different in the way Grace looked at me, and in the way Dylan carried himself. There was no denying it, the trip had changed something fundamental. We had finally started to unravel the tight knots of misunderstanding that had kept us trapped in the same old patterns for so long. But this time it was a comfortable quiet. No one was avoiding eye contact, and no one seemed desperate to fill the space with forced chatter. It felt natural, like we were finally at ease with each other. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't dreading the hours that stretched ahead of us. After we ate, I suggested we take a walk in the woods. The air was crisp, and the leaves had begun to change color, splashing the ground with shades of gold and red. It felt like the right moment to reflect, to take a step back from everything and just breathe. Grace agreed, and Dylan, without much of a protest, tagged along. We walked in relative silence, with the occasional murmur of agreement or observation as we pointed out a particularly vibrant patch of foliage or a tree with an unusual shape. It wasn't a deep conversation, but that wasn't the point. We were just there, moving together through the forest. For once, the tension between us felt manageable. As we came to a clearing near the edge of the woods, Grace stopped and looked around. "This is beautiful," she said, taking in the view of the valley below. The late morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows and creating a sort of natural spotlight on the landscape. "It's one of my favorite places," I said, a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Dad always said it reminded him of home. Just the quiet of it, the simplicity. Dylan, who had been mostly quiet, gave a small grunt of acknowledgement. "It's peaceful," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It is," I agreed, feeling a surge of gratitude for the place. "And it's the kind of peace that's earned, you know? Nothing ever comes easily. But here, it feels like all the noise of the world disappears for a while." We stood there for a moment longer, the silence between us now comfortable rather than awkward. It felt like we were all processing something, like we were each holding pieces of the puzzle, quietly fitting them together. Eventually, we began the walk back to the cabin. As we approached the house, I could see the familiar outline of Frank's truck parked in the driveway, and I felt a pang of anxiety stir in my chest. Frank had been my father's best friend, and in many ways, he had stepped into a surrogate father role after my own father passed away. His presence was always a reminder of the life I was trying to hold on to, and also a reminder of the legacy I was still struggling to understand. I hadn't told Grace or Dylan that Frank was coming by. I wasn't sure how they'd react, but I felt it was important for them to meet him, to understand how much of an impact he had on my life. Frank had always been a rock for me, someone who would speak bluntly but who always had my back. But today, I wasn't sure what kind of reception he would get. "Let's just keep it simple," I said to Grace and Dylan, a slight edge of uncertainty creeping into my voice. "Frank's not going to be here for long, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page." "Same page about what?" Dylan asked, raising an eyebrow. "I just want us to show him the respect he deserves," I said. "He's been a big part of my life, And he's someone who knew my dad in a way that no one else really did. Grace nodded slowly, though there was a hesitation in her eyes. I could tell she wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea, but she wasn't objecting either. Dylan, on the other hand, wasn't hiding his discomfort. He shifted from foot to foot, clearly wanting to argue but unsure of what to say. We walked into the cabin, and there he was, Frank, sitting at the kitchen table, a beer in hand, looking just as I remembered him. Solid, unshakable, with a bit of a rough edge. He looked up as we entered, his face breaking into a grin. "Ethan, it's good to see you," Frank said, standing and pulling me into a quick hug. "Didn't think I'd get you out here, but here you are." "It's been a while," I said, returning the hug but keeping my distance. I gestured to Grace and Dylan, who were standing off to the side, looking at Frank with varying degrees of uncertainty. "This is Grace, my wife, and Dylan, my son." Frank's gaze shifted to Grace first, then to Dylan. He nodded slowly, sizing them up. "Nice to meet you both," he said gruffly, his tone friendly but no nonsense. "Nice to meet you," Grace said, smiling faintly, though there was a hint of wariness in her eyes. Dylan just nodded, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say anything, but his posture spoke volumes. He wasn't thrilled about Frank's sudden appearance, but he wasn't about to make a scene either. Frank didn't seem to notice or care. He simply gestured toward the table. "Sit down. I've got enough beers for everyone." We all took a seat, and for a few moments the conversation drifted into comfortable small talk. Frank asked about how I was doing, about the cabin, about the time we'd spent here. But as the conversation continued, I could sense the unease building in the room. Grace was still being polite, but I could tell she was holding something back. Dylan, as usual, wasn't saying much at all. I needed this to go well. It was important that Frank felt respected, that Grace and Dylan understood just how integral he was to my life. But I could feel the friction beginning to bubble up beneath the surface. "Tell me, Frank," Grace said after a while, her voice hesitant but curious. "How did you and Ethan's father meet? What was he like?" Frank leaned back in his chair, his eyes softening. "Your father was a good man," he said. "Tough as nails, but fair. He didn't take crap from anyone, but if you earned his trust, you were set for life. He had a way of making people feel like they mattered, a way of making them feel like they were family." I could see Grace's shoulders relax, a bit of warmth creeping into her gaze. Dylan was still silent, but I could tell he was listening now. "Tell me more about the kind of man he was," Grace continued, her voice softer now. Frank smiled faintly. "He was always the first to help someone in need, even if it meant putting himself last. He didn't talk about his sacrifices, but we all knew he made them. And he did it because it was the right thing to do." The room went quiet for a moment, and I saw Dylan shift in his chair, his arms unfolding. He looked at me, then at Frank, as though seeing something new in both of us. It wasn't much, but it was progress. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the cabin grew warmer, more comfortable, though still tinged with the weight of everything that had come before. Frank had that ability. He could fill a room with his presence, and in his own gruff way he made things seem a little less heavy. Still, there was something beneath the surface, a tension that I couldn't shake. I wasn't sure if it was the awkwardness between Grace and Dylan or the strange feeling that I was about to reach some sort of turning point. Either way, I could feel it in my bones. The end of this trip was approaching, and whatever changes had taken root in the past few days were now on the cusp of either growing into something lasting or crumbling under the pressure. We had dinner around the small table, sharing stories and passing around dishes as Frank continued to talk about my father. He seemed to know so much about the man I'd once called Dad, a man who had, in the last years of his life, grown distant and secretive. I couldn't deny that hearing Frank speak about him with such reverence was a kind of relief. The old memories began to take shape in a way I hadn't been able to before. For a few hours, I wasn't the son who had been left behind. I was just a man sitting at the table with a friend of my father's, recalling a past that had once seemed somewhat reserved, had begun to engage more. There were small moments of connection, like when Dylan asked Frank about his own experiences with the military, or when Grace commented on how similar my father's values were to the way we tried to raise Dylan. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. After dinner, we gathered on the porch to watch the stars. The air was cooling, and the smell of the wood burning in the stove lingered in the cabin's walls. Frank had decided to stay the night, a rare occurrence that felt both like a gesture of goodwill and an unspoken acknowledgement that this was a moment of significance. We sat there for a while, the quiet of the night broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Frank was the first to speak. "I know things haven't been easy for you," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the same tone he'd used when we were younger, when I was facing the toughest times of my life. "But you've got something here, Ethan, something worth holding on to. Don't let it slip away." I turned to face him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I'm trying, Frank," I said, "but it's harder than I thought." He chuckled softly. "It always is, but it's worth it. Don't let the past drag you down. Your dad wouldn't have wanted that." The weight of his words sank in slowly, and I realized he was right. I had spent so much time carrying the past around like a burden, not allowing myself to truly understand it. It wasn't just about my father's death. It was about the way I had been living, the way I had allowed my relationships to deteriorate. The trip had made me confront that, and now I had to decide what I wanted to do with the pieces. Grace and Dylan had retreated inside by now, and I remained outside with Frank, the two of us sitting in silence, both of us understanding that this was the calm before whatever storm was coming. Later that night, after Frank had left and the house had settled into the stillness that only comes after a long day, I sat in the living room alone, reflecting. Grace and Dylan were upstairs, probably still processing everything. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were so many things left unsaid between us, but I felt different, more grounded, more prepared to face the inevitable challenges. As I sat there, I thought back to the words Frank had spoken earlier. "Don't let it slip away." He was talking about the legacy my father had left behind, but I realized he was also talking about the legacy I had the chance to build with my own family. Grace and Dylan were right there, and they were willing to work through the tension, to confront the things that had been holding us all back. I wasn't alone in this fight. The next morning, after a long night of reflection, I gathered everyone in the kitchen. Grace and Dylan were sitting at the table, still half asleep but awake enough to know something important was coming. "I've been thinking," I started, my voice steady. "I know I haven't been the best at communicating. I know I've let things go too far, but I want to make things right. I want us to have a chance to rebuild, to really rebuild. Not just pretend things are fine." Grace looked at me with a mix of surprise and uncertainty. Dylan was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. "I'm not asking for perfection," I continued, "but I'm asking for honesty. I want us to be a family again the way we were meant to be. I want us to talk about what's really been going on, about everything." There was a long silence. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I didn't expect Grace to be the first to speak. "I know I've held back," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And I know I've been distant, especially with you, Ethan. But I think we've all been afraid of what's next, afraid of opening up." "I get it," I said. "I've been just as afraid. But I can't keep living like this, and I don't want you or Dylan to feel like you have to, either." Dylan, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up for the first time in hours. "I've been confused," he said. "I didn't understand why things were the way they were. But I want to try. I want to figure this out too." The relief I felt in that moment was indescribable. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was the beginning of something. I could feel the walls between us beginning to crack, slowly but surely. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope rise in my chest. We spent the next few hours talking, really talking. We went through the tough moments, the misunderstandings, the things we hadn't said but had all been feeling. It wasn't easy, it was raw, painful even, but it was real. And for the first time, I felt like we were laying the groundwork for something better. Later that day, as we packed up to leave the cabin, I realized that this trip hadn't just been about saying goodbye to my father's memory. It had been about saying goodbye to the old versions of ourselves. We were finally letting go of the resentment, the fear, and the anger that had been poisoning our relationships for so long. The drive back home was quiet, but it was a quiet that felt peaceful, not heavy. We were on our way to a new chapter, and though it wouldn't be easy, I knew we had the tools to make it work. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next.